And the best advice I ever got was, forget about that mountain. Just climb the clearest hill. Like, you see that hill over there? It's 100 feet tall. Just climb up to the top of that. Because you know what? When you get to the top of that hill, the air parts, things are a little clearer. The path to the next hill, you can't see it down here, but you can see it there. So get there and then figure out what's your next hill to climb. So forget about like the destination. Just focus on the one thing, make that better, and trust me, the next hill will appear. So that's what I would advise.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel Petitpoff. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I have been looking forward to today's guest. We did an interview on his show, the Upsourced Accounting show, a while back. It was one of the favorite interviews that I've done because we got so into the weeds and so nerdy. Our guest today is a person that I can really go deep on finances and KPIs and numbers with, and really understands the relationship between finance and operations, because prior to starting an accounting firm that's focused specifically on agencies, he ran finance and operations at an agency that scaled to over 50 people, had an exit. And so he's been in the weeds. So with all of that, Ryan Watson, thank you very much for being here today.
Marcel, I have also been looking forward to this. This is going to be a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
I am pleased that you are here. So before we jump into the weeds together with our audience, I want to give you a chance in your own words to describe who you are and what you do at Upsourced and how you help agencies.
Yeah, totally. So obviously, I'm Ryan. I'm one of the founding partners at Upsourced. Upsourced, I mean, if I only used a few words, I would say we're an accounting firm for creative agencies. I'd say that's a little bit of a misnomer in that unlike traditional accounting firms, we really don't focus on the more classical compliance services like audit and tax. Our focus is predominantly on what I would describe as outsourced CFO services. And so, really we're going to work with agencies in one of two buckets. One bucket is helping them organize the financial and in some cases non-financial data to help them make decisions, and then taking that data and adding some context and meaning to it. So, for listeners of your podcast, there's a lot of complementary natures between what we do on the financial data side and what you all do on the non-financial data.
Yeah. And this is one of the things that I really appreciate about you and your perspective is I think you acknowledged a lot of the shortcomings that financial data typically has as it relates to strategic decision making. And you've adapted your firm to round out your service offering to compensate for some of those shortcomings, either by bringing in non-financial metrics like utilization and average billable rates, which are some of the things you look at with clients, and being able to facilitate conversation around the numbers. Because as you know, depending on whether you're doing cash or accrual based, or how your accruals are being done, what the methodology is there, what the structure of your chart of accounts is, like, it can make it such that you need a conversation around those numbers. Otherwise, they might be misleading. So I really appreciate that about your perspective, and I'm excited to dive in today.
Totally. Love it. Me too. Let's do it.
All right. So you have been through a scaling experience yourself, and you've taken a lot of clients through that experience as well. And I think the frame for today's conversation is, I think there is a lot of messaging out in the industry. We both, I think, struggle with this. You go and you read a blog post and it's telling an agency owner that there's 25 different KPIs that they need to be measuring at all times. Otherwise, they're failing to run their business. And there's these arbitrary benchmarks and certain ratios and numbers that you need to hit. Often within the blog post, I've noticed this, they're not even consistent with each other within the post. So I'm like, well, this doesn't make any sense. Nobody did the math.
These two things don't align.
And so what we end up with, I'm sure you have this conversation a lot too, is an insecure agency owner that gets on a call with us and they're like, oh, I know I'm underperforming. And it's this really like negative self-talk about we're failing in all these different areas. We're not hitting all these benchmarks, but there's no context. And they're just struggling to get any value out of all the time and energy that goes into measuring things, and not really able to reconcile the right numbers, the right way to think about those numbers to the context that they're in as a business. And so let's open up that conversation. What has your experience been in terms of finding agency owners that are trying to improve the way that they measure the business and some of the mistakes and traps that they're falling into that are really working against them.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head earlier in that preamble. As you know, I'm listening to you, and I'm have got a lot of deja vu because I experience this all the time. And we often get, you know, either it's an existing client of ours that we've been working with for a while and has found themselves struggling, or a brand new client, and they'll have, you know, printed off this blog post and they'll come and they've got this very strong desire to say, oh, okay, well, we need to be managing, or I need to be managing to this like dashboard of 15 KPIs or whatever it is, right? I read this post that says we should be doing these things. And ultimately, not to say that this is the only trap that I find, but one of them is that. And it's, you know, my reaction is, yes, definitely. Those are 15, 20 KPIs for sure. But the reality is, should you be managing to all of those right now? In all likelihood, definitely not. In all likelihood, there's probably just one or two things that matter right now. One or two things that matter right now. And your focus should be exclusively on those things. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One reason is, again, you alluded to the agency owner that's feeling downtrodden and bummed out. And again, when you're looking at this sea of red, your natural inclination is to bury your head in the sand. I mean, we see this in clients who cancel monthly or quarterly or weekly meetings with us because they just don't want to face this data, right? And well, that doesn't do anybody any good. Now we're moving backwards and not forwards, but it's this highly emotional thing, and so what we have found is that the most important thing an agency owner can have is momentum. Like, there's just nothing more important. When you have momentum and the wind is at your back, things feel like an inevitability. Like improvement across whatever your thing is, it feels like just a function of time, right? But you can't build momentum when you're trying to fight a war on like 10 fronts, which is what that dashboard of the 10 or 15 KPIs is creating. It's creating a war on 10 or 15 fronts. Meanwhile, these things are all related. Like this, if you have a gross margin, if you have a utilization problem, you also have a gross margin problem, you also have a net margin problem. What are we trying to fight all of these at the same time for? Let's focus on one thing and build consistent progress so we feel good. And let's also focus on the highest leverage thing, right? Like ultimately, if we have a gross margin problem and the highest leverage cause of our gross margin problem is our utilization problem, great. Let's just start there. That's not to say that's the only challenge that we have, but once we're on the other side of solving our utilization problem, the picture's going to look different, and our prioritization can take place, our reprioritization can take place after that. So anyways, that's just a long-winded way of me saying distraction and negative talk can be really challenging, and by focusing, we can start to create just a little bit of momentum and change like the emotional tide, which hopefully changes the performance tide. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And I see it all the time. I'm so glad we're talking about this. A mentor of mine once said something really profound to me. I didn't realize how profound it was at the time, of course, because I was young.
Sure.
But then as it grew on me like mold, so to speak. And it was the simple message of overwhelm is just a lack of clarity. Mm. And as I went through my life, I realized, and I had moments where I was feeling overwhelmed, and I sat down and I just journaled for a few minutes, or I got organized, or I reviewed all the things I had going on and deprioritized stuff. I realized just how truthful that is. Totally. And I think that is one of those reactions that we sometimes have as agency owners when we feel that something's not going well. We conflate measuring everything and adding complexity and trying to be precise with accuracy and clarity, but it actually ends up working against us a lot of the time. But there's also a certain degree of mastery that's required. I think you and I maybe take this for granted sometimes, where we've seen it so many times that we look at a situation, we have a 5-minute conversation with someone, we know immediately what's going on.
What's the issue? Yeah.
And it's not that way for them. And so I think that's a big part of the reason why the initial reaction to something's not going on and I don't know what's up is to try and measure everything. So for somebody that's in that state, what's the recommendation on how they can start to work backwards to a simpler framing that allows them to find that clarity and move forward?
Yeah, great question. So, we have a couple of frameworks. These are not like completely unique ways of thinking about the world. It's just our way of trying to organize these concepts to make them just a little bit more consumable. So we talk with our clients about a couple. The first is what we describe as the life cycle of agencies, which we can talk more about. But overall, what we've done is said, look, agency, we have over 100 marketing agency clients. We have seen this movie very many times. And so the reality is agencies at different stages of their maturation have very similar challenges and therefore have very similar priorities, right? So we divide these into what we call create mode, which is your classic 0 to 1, and that in the Peter Thiel context, but also in like 0 to 1 million. So 0 to 1 million is create mode, getting the thing off the ground. Then what we have is build mode, which I'll come back to because that's where a lot of these challenges live. Build mode is what I describe as the agency sort of after that first inflection point around $1 million up to, let's say, 3 to 4 million in revenue. That's build mode. And then on the other side of build mode, we have what we call grow mode, which is, let's say, that 3 to 4 million inflection point up to, call it 8 to 10 million. And on the other side of that, we call scale mode. And this is a big business that would like to be a really big business. Anyway, we've organized those in these stages so that we can talk about how to pick the one thing that matters in each stage. And so for the build mode, that 1 million to 3 to 4 million, where the majority of, at least in our experience, where we're finding agencies that have a business, they exist, but profitability feels elusive. There's probably a variety of reasons why it feels elusive. And in that realm, we believe that the game is about clearing what we describe as the hierarchy of financial needs. And so the hierarchy of financial needs is just this thing. It's just this way of organizing KPIs away from let's attack 15 to let's attack one at a time. So the hierarchy of financial needs is just like Maslow's hierarchy, where I can't worry about self-actualization until I have shelter. Similarly, we have these 5 steps. At the bottom is solvency, right? Like, can I pay my bills next week? And if I can't, then I'm not going to be particularly focused on my sales pipeline right now, because that's not going to convert to business and revenue and an invoice and cash quickly enough to solve my solvency problem. So we're just going to put that on a shelf, right? So that's the bottom, and we work our way all the way up to repeatable revenue generation. But again, ultimately, you're only on one step at a time, and we're just focused on building momentum, clearing the step, lifting our head, and then looking at the next step. So, we have these little frameworks that help us decide, okay, there's all these challenges. What's my one thing? What is the one thing that I need to care about in this moment?
Hey, it's Marcel here, and I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. If you are, then I want to encourage you to check out the Agency Profitability Toolkit. It's a free set of resources that we've put together to help agency owners just like you improve their profitability. It's full of free checklists, templates, and training videos, and has helped thousands of agencies get better at measuring the essentials of their business. So if you want to grab a free copy of that, you can head to parakeeto.com/toolkit or look for a link wherever you're watching or listening to this. With that, I want to thank you again for tuning in, and I'll let you get back to the episode. Well, as you know, on this show, we like to get tactical. So if we could, let's double click on that hierarchy of financial needs. I'd love to start there. Yes. What is kind of the quick run through of where it starts and where it ends as you kind of get through $1 million? All right.
I'll go through it. It'll be, and then we can go into more details. But so the first is solvency, as I described, right? Again, if I have a cash flow crisis, then it's all hands on deck, and we're just trying to convert AR to cash, or we're trying to access outside sources of cash just to keep the business alive. Once we've solved our cash crisis, if we are there, then the second is project profit is what we call it, but it's gross margin, right? It's gross margin. So gross margin is the next thing that matters the most. And again, you know this better than anyone, right? If I have a gross margin problem, then I have one of a couple of other real challenges or opportunities. One being I have a utilization problem, or the other being I have a rate per hour or a revenue per head problem, right? And so if I'm there, okay, that's where we're at, and that's what we are going to focus on. If we should be if on the other side of our gross margin, once we've cleared the gross margin step, then we can talk about clearing that. I mean, benchmarks are, every client's ideal gross margin can be very different. I have some clients at 60%, and that's great. I have other clients at 40%, and that's also great for their type of business. Anyways, after that, then I'm at cash reserves. So, okay, unit economics are good. Now I need to store away enough cash to sustain the sort of highs and lows endemic to project-based cash flow, which the majority of our clients have. On the other side of cash reserves, then now I'm looking at net profit. And so, operating margin, am I clearing enough net cash for this business? And then, and once we've solved gross margin, this is a relatively simple exercise of operating expenses, right? It's your classic budgeting exercise. And so on the other side of operating profit, then the fifth and final, the sort of marquee, the capstone is predictable revenue generation. Like, do I have some degree of machinery so I can actually predict revenue with a reasonable amount of certainty? Do I have a consistent inbound or outbound machinery? And we would say that those five things are required before you're officially in grow mode as an agency.
Yeah. It's a great framework. It tracks perfectly to kind of what we see as well, right? You've got to get that foundation in place first. It's like, if you're going to run out of cash, the business is going to die. So that's like life and death situation. Yep. Gross margin sets the foundation. Without that, everything's going to feel hard. And of course, this is the conversation that we have every week, where there's all these symptoms, and they all lead back to, like, you just fundamentally don't have gross margin. But once you get that in place, then you can start lifting your head up. And it's perfectly aligns to this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? It's like, once you don't have cancer basically as a business, which is like every time we sell something, we're already failing because our gross margin's not good.
We're underwater.
Then you can lift your head up.
Yeah.
Totally. And start doing these things that are like, that optimize, right? Having cash reserves, being able to weather the storm, being able to look forward. So it tracks really perfectly. How does that align to, some of these different revenue benchmarks that we see agencies getting stuck at?
Oh, you mean like in terms of like revenue size?
Yeah. So as a company starts to progress, what's been your experience on how that changes the outlook and the focus?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, so, none of these are perfect, and there's exceptions all over the place. Like, I have some clients in the like 1.5-2 million area who have really genuinely cleared all five. But in my experience, your $2 to $3 million agency is often still working their way through these things. I just personally have not seen I have not seen many. Maybe I have seen one, but I can't think of a good example. An agency who has cleared that like $3-4 million growth or AGI range without having predictable revenue growth. In other words, by relying on organic, referral, sort of like incidental revenue generation, I think there's an obvious ceiling on how large this business can get. And I haven't seen one eclipse the 3 to 4 million. And so, in our experience, once you've cleared the hierarchy of financial needs and you're at that 3 million, things feel good. It's like, wow. I mean, like, we're rocking, we're cranking. I can't imagine anything slowing us down until it does stop, until things start to break. And we have, I can think of a half a dozen clients in the last 6 months who have all experienced this exact same emotion around this 3 to 4 million, where it's like, oh my gosh, we were doing so great, and now things are just getting so much harder. Clients I'm feeling tension with my team. Clients are churning, and our read of this, and Marcel, I'd be very interested in your take as well, but our read of the primary cause of this is the core leadership team, right, that ultimately got you through that grow or that build mode stage is now increasingly degrees of separation away from the actual work that's getting performed, right? There's several layers removed, and they are in some cases a bottleneck, and the business is now just too big for that owner or that couple partners to bear hug all the service and all the decisions. And what is required is that next level of leadership, the deputies within the organization, to be delegated to, held accountable to, incentivized to drive the vision and the goals of the business. And ultimately where we come in is, okay, well now we need to manage this business not as one, but in disaggregations, right? Either through portfolio managers who have a suite of clients and they're held to maintaining some kind of margin, or through departments like the design department or the development department. And these leaders need to be empowered to make decisions, to hire their team if they need to, but ultimately to be held accountable to whatever the goals of the organization are. And that is really rocky evolution. It's a very rocky change. And so again, ultimately that's where a lot of the focus shifts at that like 3 to 4 million inflection point.
Yeah, it's absolutely the same experience that we've had. And I find that, of course, there's two things that are hard about, well, there's more than two things, but generally speaking, there's two things that are hard about that transition. The first is like the leadership aspect of that, which is, it involves hiring a different type of person. A lot of the times it involves changing your leadership style. It involves letting go of things. Like there's a lot of psychological leadership team dynamics that have to get worked through. And that stuff is all very nuanced and challenging for the organization and for the leadership team. And then what we've seen is it requires you to empower people with data that generally hasn't existed before. And the complexity of that data goes through the roof because now you're having to thoughtfully determine these segmentations, right? And create sets of data that are relevant to each department. And no two agencies look the same. So it's up to you to determine what are these segmentations? What are the naming conventions? What data are they going to have access to? Do we want to do full open book management? Or are we going to use an alternative framework that allows us to empower them with visibility without crossing over that line? And what I found is that so many firm owners don't have enough confidence in their own numbers to be able to show it to their team. Like they don't even really understand it well. So they're like, well, how am I going to open this up to the team? And it becomes a big blocker. At least my perspective is obviously biased because I talk to people within that lane, but that's been, my experience.
Well, I totally agree. And I mean, I would say like if I were to go even broader, like overall, the biggest challenge, and you described one of the reasons, but there are probably many, is that the biggest challenge is that, okay, you might have decided, no, I'm doing this. I've got a content head and I've got a development head and we're like running it. But ultimately, these people are leaders in name only, right? Like you've kept all of the information close to the vest. You're still either making all the decisions, or you have this like super veto where like nobody's going to make an independent decision or go out on a limb because they know you're just going to make the decision anyway. And so it's this like failure in execution of truly saying like, okay, no, you all are the leaders and this is what it means. And rather than, dictating to them exactly how to do their job, and they're just sort of like a proxy for you, giving them the autonomy to make choices and having like a good feedback loop where you can meet and talk about how it went and then talk about what you want to do differently the next time. Like that's the thing that is really missing. It's people think, and it's not an accusation among people. It's just it's very easy to underestimate how much work goes into truly setting these people up independently for success. And being hands off to a greater degree than it feels comfortable.
And this ties so perfectly back to the original point that we opened the episode on, which is if you're managing them and holding them accountable to a dashboard of 25 metrics that are inconsistent with one each other and are nonsensical, I mean, everyone is set up for failure in that instance. You won't know what's going on. They won't know what's going on. You won't be able to facilitate good conversation. And so it really behooves you to narrow into a framework that's simple, that can be managed towards. Yeah, it becomes so critically important at that. And that's exactly why we see so many firms, I think, get stuck at that level, or they keep scaling past it and then receding back to it because they start experiencing all the gross margin problems that come with not having the clarity on those numbers as they cross over it, and they end up having to keep pulling back.
Totally.
It's fascinating how, the people that I talk to that are kind of in the same game and see it at such volumes, like the patterns are so clear. And it's kind of like bittersweet, isn't it? Because it's like, it's so clear to us, but I just wish that I could help everyone and explain it, because it's simple, but it's not easy. So what advice do you have for someone that maybe is listening to this and they're resonating a lot and they're thinking like, well, great, now you've got me feeling heard and seen with all my problems, but I still don't know what to do about it. What advice do you have for that person who's listening and wants to take a next step?
Yeah, good question. Well, I mean, outside of the, the very self-serving, work with Marcel or work with us. I mean, again, I think Well, a couple of things that I think if you're listening and you're feeling seen, you're feeling like, I suspect you're at one of these inflection points we described, whether you're at the sort of build mode, what we describe as build mode inflection point, where you've got an agency that's there and there's demand, but you really are struggling to get any form of profitability, and it feels like you're working 100-hour weeks, or you've cleared that stage and you keep bumping into this ceiling and knocking back down. The first thing I would say is take a lot of comfort in the fact that you are not alone, and dispense with all the negative self-talk and the navel gazing at all these other agencies who are doing a great job. I can tell you, anytime I look at a benchmark in a blog post and compare that to the median of our portfolio, there's a pretty big disconnect, okay? The reality and the ideals are very far apart. So if you feel like you are not living the ideal, you're the median. So don't worry. The second thing, again, is I am a big proponent, as you probably have heard throughout this discussion, is I'm a very big proponent in focus, right? And so the thing I challenge our team on every time I have a client conversation is, what's the one thing before I look at a financial report, before I hear how the client is doing and what conversation we're having with them, what's the one thing? What's the one thing that matters for this agency? And if you as an agency owner don't feel like you have a lot of clarity around what the one thing that you need to be focused on right now is, then look, Marcel's got a lot of content. We just put out a whole suite of content around this life cycle of agency framework and how you might find yourself in it and what your one thing is. And you can find that on our YouTube channel or at upsourcedaccounting.com. So yeah, I mean, ultimately it's find your one thing and focus. I think the one thing I'll say, when you mentioned the anecdote that you got from your mentor, I got very similar advice that rhymed, but it was different, which was, I think when you're building a business, you like to look to the top of whatever mountain you're trying to build. So if you've decided, I want to be whatever it is, a $20 million multidisciplinary agency, then you like to sort of build your plans, linearly to that mountain. And the best advice I ever got was, forget about that mountain. Just climb the clearest hill. Like, you see that hill over there? It's 100 feet tall. Just climb up to the top of that. Because you know what? When you get to the top of that hill, the air parts, things are a little clearer. The path to the next hill, you can't see it down here, but you can see it there. So get there and then figure out what's your next hill to climb. So forget about like the destination. Just focus on the one thing, make that better, and trust me, the next hill will appear. So that's what I would advise.
Sage advice, and a lot of resonance here for me. Unsurprisingly, as we chat, Ryan, every time we get on a call, we do an interview, I just feel like we become better besties. And so
we are aligned.
We're aligned. We're aligned. Brian's not ready to commit to being besties, but he will admit to being aligned.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, we're besties. We're besties. Sorry. Yes. No. We're besties.
You heard it here first. Ryan and Marcel, besties.
That's right.
So for everyone that wants to be your bestie, where should we send them in the show notes to get access to the resources you mentioned and also follow you online?
Real fast. If we're besties, though, I got to get myself one of these parrot shirts. So you're going to have to tell me where to find one. But second of all,
agreed.
So if you want to find us, again, you can see us at upsourcedaccounting.com, or we put a lot of content out on YouTube at Upsourced on YouTube. Drop us a line. We're happy to, even if you just want to chat about where you are and what you should be focused on, we're more than happy to jump on a call and talk to you.
With that, Ryan Watson, the amazing, the one and the only, great to have you. Thanks for being here. And we'll see you all listeners on the next episode.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcel.